What we're doing is presenting about in situ fluorescence spectroscopy for inline distillation process monitoring explicitly for SPD today. My name is Jonathan Kenneth Bunn, or Dr. Jonathan Kenneth Bunn. I have a PhD in chemical engineering. I'm the chief scientist here at ArometriX. And this?
I'm Christopher Medding. I'm a PhD in materials engineering from the University of Maryland, and I am the CTO of ArometriX. Yeah, that's what I am. So we want to go? Are we ready to go?
Yeah, I guess we can just go ahead and start.
All right, guys, we're going to start. All right, so like Kenneth said, we're going to be talking to you about the work we've been doing in situ fluorescence spectroscopy as a tool for inline monitoring of the distillation of cannabinoids. So we gave this presentation at the Cannabis Science Conference. As was noted, we took Ricky Lake's spot. And so what we're doing is just giving a bigger forum for this same presentation that we gave so that more people could have access to it. So just want to give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, most of you are going to know this, but we're going to talk a little bit about short path distillation and why process control is so important for it. We're going to go into the initial work we carried out to figure out, what could be done in process control, some of the novel experiments that we did there. We'll go into some of the measurements we made on a benchtop configuration to get a better idea of what the technology and the metrology could do for the distillation process. We'll talk about targeting specific compounds and learning more about specific cannabinoids with the system. We'll wrap that all in and show how we converted this information that we had into a true inline monitoring system. We'll go with some conclusions that we made and also looking at the path forward, where we want to go from where we are. And I'll just, then we'll summarize all of that. So I'm going to give it to Kenneth. He's going to talk about short path distillation.
Okay, so I realize that most of you guys probably already know this information, but for those of you that don't, I'm going to give just a very short overview of what short path distillation is. So short path distillation is a thermal distillation process for the separation of different chemical compounds and molecules from a mixed batch. In the case of hemp and cannabis distillation, what this means is that basically you have a mixed batch or crude, or basically what we call extract, and you want to actually separate it into getting higher purity cannabinoids. Usually we are desiring delta 8 and delta 9 THC or CBD, depending on what we're distilling. This process traditionally occurs in 3 stages. You have your head stage, which is your degraded terpenes, some leftover solvents, and some light boiling compounds. You have your main body, which is the desired pharmaceutical agents that we are actually trying to purify. So like I said, delta 8, delta 9, usually people looking for delta 9, but delta 8 and delta 9 THC and CBD, as well as some other cannabinoids that some people might be interested in. And then you have your tails fraction. Your tails fraction is actually usually degraded cannabinoids, as well as some leftover coloring agents from the extraction process. And you will actually throughout, if you have chlorophyll in your crude, you'll actually get chlorophyll throughout. So each separation during this process occurs at a specific temperature and pressure. So if you know your pressure and you know your temperature, then you can kind of, in an ideal world, determine what you're actually separating out at that time. But that kind of leads us into some process control opportunities for SPD. So determination of the endpoint or when your fractions are changing is critical for distillation efficiency. So for instance, if you let your heads run on too long, then you'll end up getting either solvents or terpenes inside of your actual distillate, so your THC, and that can be very bad for regulatory reasons as well as health reasons, and if you let your main bodies go on too long, then you'll end up either cutting your actual potency of your final product, as well as you'll just get some degraded degraded cannabinoids, as well as some colorants in there, so your distillate doesn't look as pretty either. You can also have failures in your equipment. So for instance, this is a vacuum distillation process. It has to be a vacuum distillation process or else you'll degrade your terpenes. And so if you have a failure in equipment, not only is this going to affect your overall quality, but it can sometimes be hard to figure out what exactly is failing in the case of something like a vacuum leak, or even if you have a failure, if you don't have a very good pressure gauge. So current control techniques, well, there's two major ones. One that I'm going to speak on that's not really inside of this presentation, but something that's important to note that a lot of people do, is they actually look at the distillation process with their eyes, and they look for slight color changes, and they use these slight color changes to determine, hey, my heads is turning into main body, and my main body is turning to tails. The problem with using color changes with your eye is, one, it's subjective. Everybody's got different eyesight, and everybody has different metrics for what the color change needs to be. So this is a massive quality control problem. Additionally, it's not very precise. You don't actually know molecularly what's going on. So a little bit better that people have actually kind of done, and this is traditional for distillation processes, is using something called vaporhead temps. So vaporhead temps is an indirect measurement of what you're distilling. Basically what you're doing is you're just measuring the actual temperature of your vapors during distillation. This is great because it can actually help you suss out what is being distilled based off the boiling point of your compounds. The issue in vaporhead temps is not only is it indirect, but with different chemical mixtures, you'll actually get different boiling points of your compounds. This is classically something that we know about in chemical engineering, something that we always have to deal with. And also vaporhead temps gets further convoluted if you have things like azeotropes, or if you have unknown compounds in your mixture, which certainly we do. We don't know all the stuff that's in our extract. So one thing that we at least were motivated to do was try to determine a direct, non-destructive measurement technique that can happen inline during distillation to actually tell you what compounds are being distilled. So with that, we actually started kind of thinking about what type of optical metrologies that we know about. We actually have a lot of experience in optical metrology systems, and we determined that two of the major ones, which we kind of adopted from HPLC style measurements, are fluorescence and absorption. So with that in mind, what we actually did is we tried to figure out, well, what's in the literature? There's not a whole lot in the literature if you actually look at fluorescence and absorption spectroscopy beside HPLC results, actually. So that kind of disheartened us, but we noticed that there was a suspicious lack of actual literature on this field since the 70s, because cannabis has become such a taboo subject, and it's been very hard legally to actually do research in this field. So we decided that against possibly I guess best scientific judgment, usually if there's nothing out there in the literature on what you're studying, it usually means that you're studying something that, you know, doesn't actually exist. But we decided to go ahead and go anyway, and we actually use something called emission excitation metric spectroscopy, or EEMS for short. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details exactly of what EEMS is. Basically, it's fluorescence spectroscopy on steroids, for lack of a better word. This is actually how you can have what we call unit operation of an EEMS. Like I said, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details about what each of these unit operations are. If you guys want to see a little bit more or have more questions about EEMS, please feel free to ask questions. We're also going to post this presentation on our webpage and potentially a link to that on our Instagram after this presentation, so feel free to come look at this a little bit later. But one thing that I'll show you about how EEMS actually does operate is what you do is you have basically a broadband, or what we call a white light source. It illuminates something called a monochromator. What a monochromator does is it actually selects a specific wavelength of light to actually allow it to shine through. So it's only transparent to a selected wavelength of light. If you were to think about this in the visible color spectrum, what that basically means is you have, you know, your overhead lighting, and it's got all these colors in it, and that's why it's white. And instead of seeing the white light, we're actually selecting a specific color like red, green, blue, yellow, whatever in that light, and only letting that light actually transmit through to our sample. So once we've actually selected what this light source is, or our excitation light, we actually illuminate the sample to that excitation light. That causes something called autofluorescence as well as absorption of the sample, and you can measure the spectrum of the the autofluorescence or the absorption from the sample using a spectrometer. So I'm just going to show you a little bit about how this happens. If you notice on this slide, the actual light that we're letting go to the sample right here is yellow, but when you wanted to change your light, you can actually change your diffraction grading a little bit, and you only allow purple light, for instance, in this case, to go through. So in this way, you can actually scan through all excitation lights, as well as actually receiving all absorption and emission spectra at the same time. So this is a great type of system. One issue with an EEMS is A, they're very expensive, and B, we did not have one on hand. So what we decided to do was build one. This is actually a quick schematic of our in-house EEMS that we built. It's pretty interesting, actually. So if you see the top left-hand corner there, that's actually an EEMS fluorescence. So if you notice, that's actually a blue light going through and it's fluorescing with green. So it's kind of neat. This system looks fairly large in this picture, but in actuality, it's small enough to fit in a suitcase and put in an airplane and fly over to California with, because that's exactly what we did. So we built this EEMS, we took it to California, we knew some distillers out there, and we knew some people that are now our redistributors out there that assisted us in acquiring different types of samples from distillation, and we measured them. Awesome. So some results that we saw, yet again, I'm not going to go through exactly how you analyze these maps. If people have questions about this, please feel free to ask them. But what this map's basically showing you is that any place that you see purple, that means that you see zero fluorescence, there's no response. When you see start seeing yellow or green or blue, that basically means that you have a fluorescence response from the EEMS. So two important fluorescence peaks that we actually saw from heads, main body, and tails is a peak that's happening at about 400 nanometers and a peak that's happening about 500 nanometers. We actually see these peaks change in relative intensities as you go through heads to main body. So in heads, we actually saw a very small confined peak at 400. My friend Chris will actually talk about exactly what the identity of this peak is a little bit later. We see a small peak in the heads, and as we transition to main bodies, we start seeing the appearance of a peak at 500, and as we go to tails, we see that 500 peak gets very bright. So this kind of gave us some initial indications that fluorescence spectroscopy could work. Now, one issue with EEMS is A, like I said, the equipment's very expensive, and B, the equipment's not really compact. Like I said, ours is a very small unit. Most of these things actually sit on a benchtop, but this is not something that you're going to clip on to a distillation column. So one thing that we did is actually tried to build a benchtop, smaller handheld system that we could do single sample testing with, I think that some of you guys actually haven't seen before because we don't sell the system. But if you've seen me actually go on site, you'll see that we always bring the system on site. And I'm going to let Dr. Christopher Medding talk a little bit more about this system right now.
Great. Yeah. So what EEMS told us was basically where we needed to look. It gave us all the information we needed about what excitations were giving us emission that was interesting. So we took that information and we, like Kenneth said, we made it smaller, more compact. We selected the specific wavelength where we saw the most interesting result from the initial EEMS results. This schematic here shows the initial prototype system that we're talking about. Now, we could have used really expensive equipment, we could have used very high sensitivity equipment, but we always knew that the goal was to have a system that could be made to work in situ, to work during the process. So from the very beginning, we only chose pieces of equipment that were conducive to this kind of online monitoring, because it didn't matter if we had really expensive, fancy equipment. It wouldn't have mattered because it needed to, in the end, be inline. So the prototype you see in the top right is the benchtop system that Kenneth was saying he takes out. So, and we did this, we took this system out to one of our partners. We measured over 20 different samples. They were everything from extracts, distillates, different processing conditions, different qualities, and we just ran everything that we could see with the HPLC results to sort of cross-validate with. And what we saw was that indeed these fluorescence signatures that we were seeing from the benchtop system were very sensitive to these different processing qualities and the quality of the material that was coming out. So you could see the difference between an extract and a distillate. You could see the difference between a poorly processed distillate and a well-processed distillate. And that really gave us the motivation to move forward and try to chase this concept of what can we really do with fluorescence in the process monitoring? But there was still a big question mark at this point. So while we have all these extracts and distillates, they're still very complex solutions. They are not individual compounds. And so it was very hard even with the 20 samples to really come down and get a good idea of what was causing this signal. And so what we decided to do was start to target specific compounds, and we did that, and Kenneth's going to talk about how we did that here.
So one thing that we did is, like Chris said, the extracts and distillate we had were obviously a mixture of different cannabinoids, things like chlorophyll, possibly some lipids, especially in the case of extract. So actually sussing out individual peak locations and what their true identity was very difficult. So one thing that we did is we actually refined our search space by buying HPLC standards. We live in a not recreational legal state, so the HPLC standards that we actually have are fairly limited, and by that I mean that we only can buy HPLC standards that have 0.1% or less of cannabinoids. So with that in mind, we knew the initial system, while it had cheap components and was very good for inline monitoring potentially, it was not going to be sensitive enough to actually detect 0.1% cannabinoids, so we did a slight redesign of our system, as you can see on the right-hand side, and we actually ended up buying a suite of different types of HPLC standards. Now, the reason these HPLC standards are important is that you end up having a solvent and the desired component. So that basically means that I'm going to have my delta 8 and I'm going to have a solvent. We could already go ahead and throw out the solvent to make sure that the solvent itself didn't fluoresce or absorb too much. Therefore, we could actually isolate the different fluorescence responses from the actual cannabinoids. And so when we ran that, one thing that we actually did run was THC, both delta 8 and delta 9, and CBD. So you can see the results from these types of tests on these HPLC standards on this slide. What you'll notice is that the delta 9 sample has a very, very strong fluorescence peak. Delta 8 has what looks to be a very similar fluorescence spectrum from delta 9, which is kind of actually makes sense given the fact that they are very closely related isomers of each other. On this, you can kind of see that the CBD actually has fluorescence. It almost looks like the CBD on this plot doesn't have fluorescence. The reason for that is that CBD does not have a very high fluorescence response, or what we call fluorescence affinity. This doesn't mean that it doesn't fluoresce. In fact, if you have a lot more concentrated CBD, which you can easily buy these days, you'll see that the fluorescence actually does exist, and it exists at a slightly different peak location than the THC does. But this is what we initially had. We literally were just trying to see if we could see basically THC and CBD, and we definitely can. We went ahead and actually went a little bit further with this. We checked out CBDA. It was just another standard that was available to us, and we thought it was kind of interesting at the time. So we also measured CBDA. You can see that CBDA has a significantly different chemical response than both the delta 8 and the delta 9 THC, as well as the CBD, which is fairly interesting. It also means that we can very easily identify CBDA. Another thing that we actually tested was we actually left that delta 9 HPLC standard out on a table in the sunlight, and as any of you guys that have ever dealt with extract know, if you leave a extract sample in the sunlight for more than like a week, you're not going to really have your cannabinoids left, and we wanted to see what would happen. So we left our delta 9 THC sample out in the sunlight for about a week or two, and then we remeasured it. And one thing that you can see is that we do not see any fluorescence response. So this is really interesting. This means that we could actually not only see delta 9 THC, but we could actually tell that the concentration was decreasing even from 0.1% delta 9 THC down to probably close to 0%. I mean, we didn't actually get an HPLC to measure this, but it's interesting to note that we could actually see the degradation. So this is really great motivation for us to go ahead and actually make an inline system for process control for SPD, which I'm going to actually let Chris talk about a little bit more right now.
That's right. So the information we got from the EEMS told us that yes, fluorescence was interesting. There was and told us where to look. We did the benchtop systems that told us yes, we can see differences. It's not always looking the same no matter what happens. And now we have the HPLC, which is telling us that yeah, we see the differences between compounds. So the next thing that was left to investigate was fine. Can we take these individual components that we used all through this and turn it into inline, and are we going to see the same changes, the same features inline that we saw during the benchtop systems and the HPLC standards? So to do that, we took, again, the same components, we configured them in such a way that they could clamp on the base of the chiller column, and we're able to investigate the changes in signals. So here is a rough schematic. I mean, you all are very familiar with short path distillation, so this is just kind of a pictorial diagram to show where the sensor goes. The sensor goes on the chiller column directly prior to the collection flask, right? So what we're getting is signal as it condenses out and flows down into the collection flask. We're actually monitoring the fluid that's at the bottom of that tube. And so in that way, we are trying to reproduce what we did on the benchtop system, but in line. And so the results of that can be seen here. These were one of the original results we got from the original prototype system that we had made. The heads, bodies, and tails are segregated out on the color plot. On the color plot, what you'll see is that the wavelength is on the x-axis, on the y-axis, the elapsed time is on the x-axis. And so we have excitation wavelength marked. That's kind of what we're using to induce the fluorescence. And what you see, first of all, is there's a few important things to note here. In the heads, we're pretty colorless up until this really large yellow blob, very broad, between about 400 and 525. And that's not necessarily expected. But what you're seeing here is when this heads was run, it was run directly after the tails of a previous process. They did not clean the glassware. And so what you're actually seeing is that the new heads are washing the old tails out of the system. So this is all of that chemistry collapsing out into the heads flask that's being collected. So that was really cool that we were able to see that, and we were able to see it wash out all at the same time. The second thing to note is that in the color plot, it doesn't look too much in the bodies like there's a lot going on, but if you look at the slices of the bodies, which is shown on the right-hand side, you see, yes, indeed, we're seeing the same feature in the same location as we saw in the Delta 8 and Delta 9 HPLC samples. Finally, if you look, and this is really interesting in the color plot, if you look at the tails, you'll see this blue swath that starts to come up and move higher and higher in wavelength, and then there's a slice of just tails, that's the green at 350 minutes. What that's showing is that there's these distinct signatures of heads, bodies, and tails correlating and corresponding to the same HPLC results and the benchtop results that we ran. So we're seeing the same phenomena that we saw all through each of the steps that we did, and are validating really that what we're seeing previously can be seen in line, which really gives us this support that this is an inline monitoring system. So just to run through some conclusions, yes, we're seeing autofluorescence, no doubt, from cannabinoids and cannabis extracts and distillates. There's several peaks, some not even shown here, that are being exhibited during these processes. And these peaks are definitely corresponding to, just from talking to experts in the field, they're corresponding to very specific segments of the separation process, heads, bodies, and tails. So there's definitely these unique signatures that these expert distillers are expecting at this point. And finally, just to sum it up, fluorescence is looking like it's a very powerful technique, more powerful than a lot of other suggested techniques for quality control, inline monitoring, and quality control in distillation and extract. But we have a lot of work to do. We're not done yet. We're moving forward, pushing forward, advancing the technology, maturing the technology. One of the things we really want to focus on is really nailing down what's autofluorescing, what all of these peaks are, why we're seeing them. Part of that is going to be to continue doing these HPLC studies, cross-correlating them with HPLC results. We want to also improve the performance of the in-situ monitoring. One of the things we're a little sensitive to right now is volume, so we want to start to work on fixing the volume so that we get a fixed volume metrology. And finally, we think that while it's really important for short path distillation, a monitoring system like this, there's a lot of potential here for extraction systems, white film systems, really anywhere where you're processing this material. There's a lot of promise for the technology to be used as a quality control. And so we're doing rigorous active research into trying to figure out how we can get this type of metrology into these types of processes. I'm just going to do an overview real quick. We talked about the EEMS, how that told us conceptually where we could look as far as fluorescence. We took that information, we folded it into a benchtop system that focused where we saw most of the results of the EEMS. That validated that we could see differences in process quality, but we still didn't know what we were looking at. So we moved into HPLC standards, these very pure, very standard samples. That gave us the confidence that yes, we knew what we were looking at, and we moved that into an in situ process or a monitoring system that could actually look in line and make sure we were seeing the same things. We saw the same things, and so this all is how we kind of scientifically came to the concept that yes, fluorescence can be used. It is a very powerful tool in being able to tell us how the quality of the process and helping lead to a better product.
So for those of you that don't have a fraction finder already, here's some quick specifications. One that I'm going to highlight real quick is the sizing requirements. So we've obviously used all this research to develop a commercial product that we now currently sell at ArometriX called the fraction finder. The fraction finder right now is compatible with any size 29 or 34 glassware. If you have size 24 glassware, then you can buy an extender/adapter unit that we already have on the shelf that you can go ahead and install on your 24 system. You'll buy a size 29 sensor in that case. Beyond that, if you guys don't have these sizes, then please contact us. We are currently actually handling a lot of custom builds. So if you have, for instance, stainless steel, we can actually help you guys by making tri-wing flanges in a sight glass. Or if you have a smaller or larger piece of glassware, then we can consult with you guys to actually help come up with adapter units to fit a fraction finder on your system. Additionally, if you guys are interested in more information about the fraction finder, please contact us, or you can contact one of our fraction finder partners here. You can also purchase a fraction finder at any of these distributors on the left. So guys, it pretty much wraps up our presentation. Before we go on to questions, I'd like to note that for those of you that either came in late or are just interested in what we said and you didn't necessarily catch it the first time, we will be posting this on our Instagram afterwards, as well as posting this on either our webpage or an Instagram story later. So at this point, I would like to actually ask you guys if there's any questions that you have about what we said, and if not, then, you know, if you have any questions in general. So we would like to answer, you know, obviously focused questions on this presentation, but maybe we missed something, or maybe you guys have other questions that we didn't necessarily go over, and we'd love to cover those as well.
So it looks like we have two questions right here. This question here maybe we want to address first, which is unit processing unit be made smaller or instead connect to a TV monitor?
So the sensor itself is pretty small. We might be able to actually make it a little bit smaller depending on exactly what your requirements are. We'll have to talk about that obviously at a later time. Can you connect it to a TV monitor? Not currently. Currently it actually uses proprietary communication protocols that we developed in-house. But if there's a large enough demand to actually connect it to potentially secondary display units, so something like a TV or traditional monitor, then we can definitely develop something for that process. I see another question from Jeremiah, who I'd also like to give a shout out. He actually made a correction during the presentation. We actually said chiller column as opposed to condenser column. Chris,
apologize.
Chris will always mess this up.
I get yelled at all the time for getting that.
Yeah.
That
So thank you, Jeremiah, for correcting Chris on that. Sorry, we don't speak Spanish. Or at least I don't. Chris, do you think you can?
Speak Spanish? No. German, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, if you wanted French, I might be able to help you. Sorry. Maybe somebody on our marketing team could help out. Can room lighting interfere with the reading? Yes, it can. We actually have light blocking tape that helps block out the light from the sensor. Now, I will say that while it can, our sensor is a little bit smarter than traditional spectrometers. We actually have light correcting algorithms on our sensor. So what actually ends up happening is we correct out most lighting from the background automatically when you buy a sensor, and you'll notice that all of our spectra look very clean and you don't see a bunch of peaks all over. If we didn't correct for background lighting, what you would actually see is a plethora of basically nonsensical peaks. The one caveat to this is that if your background lighting is too bright, it'll be a problem. Or if your background lighting is not very consistent, and by that I mean if you have very flickery lights, it can possibly cause problems for our algorithm because it's kind of looking for a more consistent feature. But ultimately, for most people, background lighting will not be a problem as long as they install the light blocking tape and the light blocker that we actually send with our sensors. You guys don't have to pay extra for that. That actually comes with our sensors.
I guess we also had discussed having a feature on the device to actually do a sort of a overview of the light in the environment. So that may be something that, based on customer feedback, we'll be able to do. So basically, you won't have to guess whether or not your background light is too high. We'll be able to actually tell you that in a upcoming release.
Yeah. Also, for those of you that really care about seeing your background light just for the fun of it, go ahead and turn the light. Like, there's a button on your display unit that says light on, light off. Turn the light off and see what it detects. What you're actually going to see it plotting is your background light. You're not going to see it doing any fluorescence or absorption spectrum. It's just your background light at that time.
So that'll tell you your background. So you can get an idea. If you don't see anything there, your background's fine.
Yep. And you will probably see a little bit there. It's not a big deal. Does the fraction finder operating using fluorescent lights, or is it a separate technology you guys have already developed? So we don't use fluorescent lights per se. We do use a very monochromatic light source, and we are measuring a fluorescence response. So basically the way that probably what you're talking about was compact fluorescent light bulbs. Those actually induce fluorescence. Compact fluorescent light bulbs have a coating that is fluorescent in and of itself, and they actually charge it with electrons in the gaseous media that they use, and that causes fluorescence, and that's why you see the light you see. No, we don't do that. What we're actually doing is we're trying to induce fluorescence of cannabinoids as opposed to any type of coating, and that's what we're detecting. 1 second, guys. I'm just trying to see what other samples that you have. Okay, how do you guys remove signal from solvents in the spectrum? Do you use fast Fourier transforms to decompose the signal, delete the particular signal, and then recompose it into an inverse FT? No, we don't do FFTs in this case. Fast Fourier transforms wouldn't help us very much because we do not have an oscillating signal. And while you could, I guess, envision this being an oscillating signal, you would cause a lot of noise by trying to do that deletion in this specific case. We are locally non-repeating features, so FFTs aren't great for us. That in mind, no, most solvents actually do not have a vastly fluorescent response, so the problem of deleting solvents for us is not a thing. We just don't actually have very much response from them.
Yeah, no solvent used in this process for sure exhibits autofluorescence. So there's no risk of contamination of the signal from solvents. And
so unless you guys are starting to migrate to toluene, benzene, or something like that, it's probably not going to be a huge issue. What's the best way to deterp enough crude to keep up with 6-inch white film evaporator? We're currently using a 20-liter SPDs. I don't know the best way to deterp something. Depends on if you're trying to reclaim your terps or if you're just trying to boil them off. I mean, if you don't want to reclaim them, then just boiling them off in a 20-liter SPD is great. If you want to reclaim them, then using a 20-liter SPD with a terp reclamation on your chiller column is probably the best way to do this. can you use it with light off to analyze grow room lighting? Yeah, you probably could. I mean, we don't right now sell it for that purpose. And if you wanted to analyze grow room lighting, what you really want is not necessarily the device that we have currently in the market. You want something called a radiometer. That's something that we actually have built in the past, and we don't sell it currently. But if that's something that people really care about, we could sell you guys radiometers.
Yeah,
as well.
I mean, if you have interest in that, and you had specific criteria that you were really interested in, this is worth contacting ArometriX, because there's a lot we can do with you if that's something you're trying to achieve. So yeah, definitely hit us up on that, because that's a really interesting place for us.
So one person asked, if you do nothing for light blocking, what percentage of degradation can a user expect? I can't answer that question. The reason I can't answer that question is because it depends on your room. I know that sounds really funny, but it's true. So if you have a naturally dark room, or you have incandescent lighting, then we're not going to have as much issue. If you use complex fluorescent light bulbs, or if you use LED light bulbs. Also, it
comes down to how high your ceiling is,
where the
location
lights
of light is. I mean, there's so many variables on it. It's very hard. I mean, we've seen a lot of both surprises, and at this point, it's people's environments and their configurations are so random at this point that's why we do the light blocking procedure that we have, because a lot of facilities are unpredictable. So, and all those variables affect what we're talking. Even the glassware will affect what kind of background from the lighting will show. So it's hard to define that as a criteria.
So one thing, guys, is that this is we're already kind of on our scheduled time. We have about 5 more minutes, so we'll take any more questions for the next 5 minutes. I'm just going to repeat this really quickly for those of you that are joining. Don't worry if you missed it as so far. We're going to actually post this both on our Instagram, and we're going to repost this later, so it's longer than 24 hours if you want to review. We'll also be posting the presentation as well. So if you're not looking to reclaim, yeah, just go ahead and boil those off. I mean, you just boil them off. I mean, you just need something that's 80 degrees Celsius, and you'll boil off most of your terps. But yeah, we only have about 5 more minutes, guys. So any more questions, please go ahead and ask them. If we don't get to them here, then we will definitely get to them on our Instagram. We'll probably just do like a QA post for you guys. What other stuff? Oh, what's the max glass thickness that can be used? We don't know. I know that if you use anything like, if you use a 1/4 inch glassware, we're going to have problems. We're actually, and shh, don't tell anybody yet because this isn't public knowledge, we're actually developing a sensor that's going to be a lot better at handling thicker glassware here in a few minutes. It's probably about a month or 2, I guess, away from public release. We're currently actually getting it tested thanks to one of our great partners. One second. I'm just having a bunch of questions coming through. About 5 minutes. I'm actually trying to see if I think I answered most of the other questions with some of my previous questions. Okay. Mainly question. Yeah, so by the way, for Jeremiah, yeah, you could totally, if you're that interested in grows, give us a call. We could actually really easily dev up something for that.
Yeah, just read his username.
I mean, yeah, well,
yeah,
PC, come on, man.
That's great.
I think I already answered that.
Yeah, all right. I mean, I guess it looks like we've answered everything.
Making sure real quick. Max glass thickness, yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. Sorry about that. I know that it's kind of thin right now.
Here's a new question.
What? What do we look for in potential employees? That's a great question. So for those of you that have actually gone to our shows, you'll know that what we usually look for is people that fit the culture of the company. That's a really confusing answer, but basically what we are is a bunch of scientists. We actually are all at this company traditionally trained scientists that were really interested in actually helping people. I mean, this is an engineering job, and rarely do you get to see your engineering go into a field and actually make an impact, and so it's pretty exciting. that in mind, we care about having self-motivated employees that don't mind relaxing. I mean, you can see that we're not very uptight guys, but at the same time, we work very hard. So, I mean, that's what we're mainly looking for in employees, is people that can learn quickly and don't mind doing a lot of work in the field, because that's mostly our day-to-day.
I want to cover this question real quick. This is an important one. Do you plan to release a set of standard spectra? In fact, so what we're doing right now is we're doing a final definitive study. What we're planning on doing right now, the Cannabis Science and Technology Journal, which is a peer-reviewed journal for cannabis and cannabis technology. We are going to be writing a journal paper. So this is a peer-reviewed, scientifically legit paper, and submit those results to that journal. And so you'll be, once that's out, I'm sure Instagram will hit it up, but you'll be able to take a look at what we write up as far as a journal response. And that's going to be the next, and that submission should be coming soon. I think the intro or the abstract is due in June or something like that. So,
I think so.
So keep an eye out for that. It hasn't been released yet, but we're actively writing a scientific journal for that.
Also, we only kind of scratched the surface with some of the HPLC standards here. This is because we are still actually going through some of the other HPLC standards. Also, these things degrade really quickly, and that's something that we didn't know initially. So
early May.
Yeah. So we will. Okay.
Sorry.
So we will actually be posting this presentation so you can see that spectrum. We will be making a campaign kind of that our marketing managers actually already kind of started. So it's pretty awesome that you'll actually see that on our Instagram. Do we have any internship opportunities? Not currently, just because we are still kind of growing. We're very fastly growing. I would say that if anybody's really interested in an internship, check back with us in 3 to 6 months, and that would be something that would be on our loadout, probably more around that time scale.
All right, I think, we got time. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate your attendance. And if you have any further questions, like Kenneth said, hit us up. We're always here. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Like Chris said, if you have any questions about this presentation, please post on our Instagram or send us an email or call us at our number. You can see our number on our website. For technical questions, call extension 3. For marketing questions, you can call extension 5. And for sales questions, you can call extension 1. So there you guys go. I hope everybody has a great day, and we will talk to you guys pretty soon, hopefully.
All right, thank you.